Whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay, hello. I'm Adoni, the founder of Spotbnb, and I just have a little amount of information for you. Do you know that for every single car in existence, every car in the world, there are 4 parking spaces in the US alone? If every single car is to move to the US, they will have 4 options to pick from, with 3 to spare, every car. Then why is parking so bad in the US? In Boston, it takes the average driver about 53 hours every year just looking for parking. In New York, it shoots up to about 107 hours, according to Boston. Why is that the case? We see that there's a clear problem with parking. It's definitely hard to find, and it's expensive even when you find it. I thought through this process and I realized that when people are looking for parking, it's either there's a few amount of parking spots, and that's what makes it expensive, especially in the cities, or they just can't find it. Maybe there are the parking spots, but it's hard to find. So I thought, if I want to make parking cheap, and I want to make it easily accessible, how would I go about this? With the rise of technology, I thought of an easy solution. Why not just put up a parking platform? Just show people here's parking. But that's not it. There's so many other parking companies out there. So why is there still a parking problem? Next slide. Yeah, I'm Adoni. As I stated earlier, a CS major minoring in both economics and entrepreneurship. And yeah, I went out to Somerville. I interviewed a couple of people. I interviewed a couple of people, and I got a couple of an amount of data talking about who finds parking expensive. Do I really think the problem is the problem? Is parking really expensive? Is parking really hard to find? Who thinks that's the problem? Who thinks it's not? And even for those who think it's not a problem, do they think they would prefer a solution for that problem? Is it a pressing issue, or is it an issue in general? And I did get an amount of data that's illustrated here. I don't want to bore you with the numbers, but let's go on to the next slide. After talking with all of these customers, I realized to make more parking spaces available to more people, we just have to create the parking spaces. But they already exist, right? And why not just make them available? You realize that there are a lot of private parking spaces. In each of these private parking spaces, only one person or only like selected number of people are allowed to park in these spaces. If they had the chance to rent out these parking spaces, their parking spaces will no longer bring them negative value. It could bring them positive value. And it could bring drivers who are looking for these parking spaces positive value. You realize that there are a couple of companies actually doing this. There are a couple of companies who are giving some people a chance to rent it to some people. There's Neighbor. It only gives you the chance to rent your parking space to your neighbor, not to any traveling person who just needs a parking space for an amount of time. There is Spacer. Spacer is this guy right here, which I am using for my go-to-market strategy. For Spacer, they are only limited to monthly parking. You rent it monthly. You don't have the chance to just use it once and drop it off. So I thought, if I'm really looking for this platform I'm trying to create, which is going to give random people a chance to rent random spaces at random periods in time to reduce the parking traffic, I can use these already existing platforms to launch my product, because you can rent parking spaces on these for free, but they have limitations. I can start off with these platforms. After I gain a little traction, I can move on to my own platform. Interesting. Next slide. Yeah. So, as I talked about competition, there are competitors. There's Waze, there's Spot Hero, there's a lot of parking spaces, but none of them are actually tackling the problem. They're just they're just like, depending on who they are, they're tackling a different kind of market. Yeah, so I'm using these Neighbor and Spacer to launch my product. Thank you.
Q&A time starts now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
I really thought it was smart how you were willing to use your competitors' products to test your own hypothesis. Do you think that the problem there might be that a lot of people are driving from suburbs to downtown and then parking spaces people are willing to rent out are actually in suburbs? Have you spoken to people?
Yes, so I spoke to a couple of people. I went to Somerville, as I said. I spoke to people in Somerville, and then I spoke to people in Boston, the city. And then I realized that people in Somerville have a lot of parking spaces. If you're a resident, the whole street is free for you, right? Like there are too many places to park. Even though they talked about things like creating a bike path that you push like some people's parking spaces to the other side of the road and a lot of stuff. It's quite easy to park in Somerville, as opposed to parking in Boston. Realize that in suburbs, there's a lot of spaces, but few people to park in these spaces. In the main cities, there are few parking spaces, but everyone wants to park. No one has a place to park. What if we could rent out like people who may live in cities, even though there are not so many? The hot spot for me is like in between cities and suburbs. But like supposing people in cities want to park, what if we can give people who live in cities the chance to rent out these parking spaces to other people who want to park there? It will make parking, if we can control the prices, we can make parking cheaper, or in general, at least we're bringing more parking spaces into the space, so it will make parking cheaper, and then it will give more people access in cities, reducing the parking time.
What time granularity do you expect to use for your rent, for the renting period?
So, personally, as a company, what we are expecting is usually people will move into these cities from 9 to 5. Like every day from 9 to 5, if they are going to keep renting like particular spaces, they'll have the option of like renting it regularly. But then there are also some people who are not always in the cities. They just probably need to park somewhere sometime once. There's also that option. So if we are talking about the repeated users, my personal projection is that there'll be lots of people who will be using it regularly. I think that's what Spacer is trying to target. They're just trying to target people who need spaces like regularly. And they've entirely ignored the market, which requires for people who need the spaces for a short period.
Yeah, one thing you may want to think about is how do you regulate the use according to what the agreement between the renter and the rentee is.
I see. Thank you so much.
Which becomes a bigger issue in the irregular use. In the regular use case, that might be okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.